In the frozen highlands of the Mongol Empire's western frontier, where the wind carved bone-deep cold into the ridges of the Tian Shan and the steppe grasses bent low beneath endless sky, a woman rode into legend not through the traditional pathways of marriage alliances or noble motherhood, but through conquest, refusal, and the deliberate weaponization of her own body. Her name was Khutulun, daughter of Kaidu Khan, and by the time Marco Polo passed through her father's court in the 1270s, her reputation had already spread across the fractured empire like smoke from a signal fire. She was the wrestler no man could defeat. She was the daughter who commanded cavalry. She was the woman who rejected every suitor who came for her, and in doing so, amassed a herd of 10,000 horses taken as forfeit from men who had tried and failed to prove themselves her equal. The chroniclers did not know what to do with her. The Persian historians framed her as curiosity, an exotic outlier in a brutal world. The Chinese annalists reduced her to footnote, an aberration in the margins of dynastic record. Marco Polo, ever the merchant of wonder, described her with a mix of fascination and disbelief, as if she were a creature from fable rather than flesh. And, in the centuries that followed, her story would be rewritten, softened, transformed into opera and myth, stripped of its political teeth and recast as romantic tragedy. But beneath the layers of distortion and erasure, the chronicles, fragmented, contradictory, and hostile, reveal something far more dangerous than legend. They reveal a woman who understood the systems that constrained her, who studied the traditions that granted men power and denied it to women, and who found within those very traditions a loophole she could exploit. She did not break the rules, she turned them into weapons, and for that, history made her pay. Khutulun was born into a world in violent transition. The Mongol Empire, that vast and terrifying achievement of Genghis Khan's vision, was no longer the unified war machine that had shattered kingdoms from the Yellow Sea to the Danube. By the time of her birth, likely in the 1260s, the empire had fractured into competing khanates, each ruled by a descendant of Genghis, each claiming legitimacy, each willing to wage war on the others to secure it. Her father, Kaidu Khan, was the last great rebel of the Mongol lineage, a traditionalist who viewed the empire's transformation with disgust and defiance. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and emperor of the Yuan dynasty, had moved the capital to China, adopted Chinese bureaucratic practices, and surrounded himself with Confucian scholars. To Kaidu, this was betrayal. The steppe had made the Mongols what they were, mobile, ruthless, egalitarian in the brutal meritocracy of survival. To settle, to build walls, to take on the trappings of sedentary civilization, was to become soft, to lose the very essence of Mongol power. And so Kaidu waged a 40-year insurgency against Kublai, a grinding, relentless conflict fought across the mountain passes and high plateaus of Central Asia. It was in this context of endless war, ideological rigidity, and steppe traditionalism that Khutulun was raised. She was not raised as a daughter in the way that Persian or Chinese courts would have understood the term. She was raised as Kaidu raised all his children, on horseback, with bow and blade, in the harsh discipline of a people for whom survival depended on skill, endurance, and the ability to kill efficiently. She excelled. Not modestly, not as a novelty, but definitively. She rode better than her 14 brothers. She fought better. She wrestled better. And crucially, she thought better. Kaidu, who valued competence above sentiment, recognized this. He took her with him into battle, not as symbolic gesture, but as tactical asset. Chinese sources describe her charging enemy lines, reaching into the chaos of cavalry combat and dragging captured commanders from their saddles with her bare hands before returning, unscathed, to her father's side. She became his confidant, his strategist, and, by all accounts, his favorite. This was not an accident of personality. It was a deliberate choice by a man who needed every advantage in his war against the most powerful emperor in the world. But it was also, inevitably, a problem. Because the steppe, for all its relative fluidity and gender roles compared to the sedentary civilizations around it, still encoded strict limitations. Women could inherit property. They could manage estates in their husband's absence. They could, in rare circumstances, serve as regents for underage sons, but they could not command armies in their own right. They could not claim thrones. They could not ultimately be khans. The system allowed Khutulun to fight beside her father, but it would never allow her to succeed him. And this tension between her capability and the structure that constrained it would define the rest of her life. The story of Khutulun is not a story of triumph. It is a story of containment, of a woman who pushed the boundaries of what was possible within a patriarchal system and discovered, with cold precision, exactly where those boundaries lay. Her story was buried by history, not through accident, but through deliberate erasure, because women who defy empires must either be forgotten or rewritten into cautionary tales. The chronicles that survive are hostile, fragmented, and contradictory. But they are enough. They reveal a woman who refused marriage, who weaponized tradition, who fought for inheritance, and who was, in the end, erased by the very systems she had mastered. This is her story. Not as myth, but as history. Not as inspiration, but as archive. And not as triumph, but as warning. To understand Khutulun, to grasp not merely the facts of her life, but the structural forces that shaped her defiance and ultimately contained it, we must first understand the world that forged her, a world balanced on the knife edge between fluidity and rigidity, between the egalitarian brutality of steppe survival and the hierarchical logic of empire building. The Mongol Empire of the late 13th century was no longer the unified war machine that had terrorized 3 continents under Genghis Khan's singular vision. By the time Khutulun came of age in the 1270s and 1280s, the empire had fractured into 4 major khanates, each ruled by a descendant of Genghis, each claiming to be the true inheritor of his legacy, and each willing to wage war on the others to prove it. In the east, Kublai Khan ruled the Yuan dynasty from his capital at Khanbalik, surrounded by Chinese bureaucrats and Confucian advisors, adopting the trappings of sedentary imperial power. In the west, the Golden Horde dominated the Russian steppes, extracting tribute from Slavic princes and controlling the trade routes that funneled wealth from Europe into Asia. To the southwest, the Ilkhanate ruled Persia, its khans increasingly Islamicized, its administration a hybrid of Mongol military culture and Persian statecraft. And in the center, in the high plateaus and mountain passes of Central Asia, Kaidu Khan waged his long rebellion, a 40-year insurgency rooted in the belief that the empire had betrayed its origins. The fracturing was not merely political, it was ideological, a fundamental disagreement about what it meant to be Mongol in a world the Mongols had conquered. Kaidu's resistance was grounded in steppe traditionalism, in the belief that the Mongols derived their power not from cities or bureaucracies, but from mobility, endurance, and the meritocratic ruthlessness of pastoral nomadic life. The steppe had made them what they were. To settle, to build walls, to adopt the customs of the conquered was to lose the essence of Mongol identity. And so Kaidu refused. He kept his people moving, his warriors mounted, his administration minimal. His court was not a palace but a collection of gurs, felt tents that could be dismantled and relocated within hours. His wealth was measured not in gold or grain but in horses and pasture land. His legitimacy came not from Confucian ritual or Persian ceremony, but from his ability to command loyalty, inspire fear, and win battles. This was the world into which Khutulun was born, a world that valorized martial prowess above nearly all other qualities, where the ability to ride, shoot, and endure physical hardship determined survival and status. In this respect, the steppe was more egalitarian than the sedentary civilizations that surrounded it. Mongol women were not sequestered. They managed households, controlled property, conducted trade, and in the absence of their husbands, governed estates and even tribal confederations. The secret history of the Mongols, the oldest surviving Mongol chronicle, records women offering counsel in political matters, arranging marriages, and influencing succession disputes. Genghis Khan's mother, Khutulun, was remembered as a woman of formidable will who held her family together through famine and exile. His wives and daughters managed vast territories and commanded respect in their own right. Yet, this relative fluidity existed within a framework of strict limitations, encoded not in written law but in the social and legal fabric of Mongol life. The Yasa, the legal code attributed to Genghis Khan, recognized women's rights to inherit property and receive a share of family wealth, but it also enshrined male authority within the household and the tribe. Women could rule as regents, but only in the temporary absence of a male heir. They could advise, influence, and manage, but they could not command armies in their own right or claim the title of Khan. The distinction was not merely symbolic. Political authority in Mongol society was inseparable from military leadership, and military leadership was inseparable from physical presence on the battlefield. A Khan was not simply an administrator. He was a war leader, someone who rode at the front of his forces, who demonstrated courage under fire, who earned loyalty through visible competence and shared risk. This created a paradox. The steppe valued strength, skill, and proven ability, yet it restricted the ultimate expression of those qualities, supreme command, to men. Khutulun was born into this paradox, a civilization that celebrated martial prowess but constrained its daughters, that allowed her to fight but would never allow her to rule. The social structure of the steppe was further complicated by its intersection with the broader imperial system. As the Mongol Empire expanded and absorbed sedentary civilizations, China, Persia, Russia, Central Asia, it encountered and partially adopted their gender norms, which were far more restrictive than those of the steppe itself. Chinese Confucianism emphasized female subordination, seclusion, and the cult of domesticity. Persian and Islamic traditions, while varied, generally confined elite women to the household and restricted their public roles. The Mongol rulers who adopted these systems, most notably Kublai Khan, began to impose similar restrictions on their own women, seeing it as part of the civilizing process, a marker of sophistication and legitimacy in the eyes of their newly conquered subjects. Kaidu rejected this. His adherence to steppe traditionalism meant that his court retained more of the old fluidity, more space for women to operate in roles that would have been unthinkable in Kublai's Sinicized Yuan court. It was this context that allowed Khutulun to become what she became, a warrior who rode into battle, a strategist who advised her father, a wrestler who defeated men in public spectacle. But it was also this context that ensured her ultimate containment, because even in Kaidu's traditionalist court, even in the relatively egalitarian world of the steppe, the fundamental rule held: a woman could not be Khan. The steppe and the system, then, were not opposites but interlocking forces, each shaping the possibilities and limits of Khutulun's life. The steppe gave her the skills, the visibility, and the opportunity to prove herself in ways that would have been impossible in a sedentary civilization. The system ensured that no matter how capable she proved herself to be, there was a ceiling she could not break through. She could fight beside her father, win his battles, manage his alliances, and command his respect. But she could not inherit his position. She could defeat every man who challenged her, amass wealth and fame, and become a legend in her own time. But she could not claim the authority those victories should have granted her. The world that forged Khutulun gave her everything except the one thing that mattered most: the right to rule. And it was this tension, between capability and constraint, between what she could do and what she was allowed to become, that would define every choice she made and every consequence she faced. The steppe had made her a warrior. The system would ensure she could never be anything more. Khutulun's father, Kaidu Khan, was the last great rebel of the Mongol lineage, a man who watched the empire of his ancestors transform into something he believed was unrecognizable and chose war over compromise. He was the grandson of Ogedei, the third son of Genghis Khan, and by bloodline alone he had a legitimate claim to supreme leadership, but legitimacy in the fractured empire of the late 13th century was no longer determined solely by descent. Kublai Khan, ruling from his glittering capital of Khan Balik, had adopted the mandate of heaven, surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, and restructured the empire along Confucian bureaucratic lines. He wore silk robes, performed rituals to ancestors in the Chinese manner, and governed through edicts written in classical Chinese script. To Kaidu, this was not adaptation, it was capitulation. The steppe had forged the Mongols into the most formidable military force the world had ever seen, and Kublai was abandoning that legacy in exchange for the approval of the conquered. Kaidu's rebellion was not merely a political struggle for territory or succession. It was ideological warfare, a 40-year insurgency waged across the high plateaus and mountain passes of Central Asia, a sustained argument delivered in blood and fire that the Mongols must remain what they had always been: mobile, martial, and uncompromising. He rejected cities, refused to adopt sedentary administrative practices, and kept his people moving, living in felt tents, grazing their herds across vast stretches of grassland, maintaining the rhythms and disciplines of pastoral nomadic life. His court was itinerant, his wealth measured in horses and loyalty, his authority derived from his ability to command men in battle and win. It was into this world of constant war and ideological rigidity that Khutulun was born, sometime in the 1260s, one of 15 children, the only daughter among 14 sons. Kaidu raised all of them identically, without sentimentality or gender distinction, because in his worldview, competence was the only currency that mattered. From early childhood, Khutulun was placed on horseback, taught to ride before she could read, trained in archery with the same expectations placed upon her brothers. The composite bow of the Mongols was not a weapon of brute strength, but of technique, requiring precise coordination between breath, posture, and release. She learned to shoot from the saddle at full gallop, to control her mount with her knees while her hands worked the bow, to strike moving targets at distances that would have seemed impossible to European or Chinese archers of the same era. She learned to wrestle, the traditional sport of the steppe, a test of balance, leverage, and endurance that held deep cultural significance. Wrestling was not merely recreation, it was a proving ground, a way to establish hierarchy and settle disputes without bloodshed. And she learned to endure. The steppe did not forgive weakness. Winters were brutal, summers scorching, water scarce, and survival depended on physical resilience and the ability to function through exhaustion, hunger, and pain. Kaidu's training was not gentle. It was designed to produce warriors, and Khutulun met every expectation and exceeded them. She excelled, not as a novelty or curiosity, not as a daughter performing adequately in a role meant for sons, but definitively, undeniably, to the point where her capability became impossible to ignore. She rode better than her brothers, fought better, wrestled better, and most dangerously for the structure that sought to contain her, she thought better. She understood strategy, the movement of forces across terrain, the timing of raids, the psychology of enemies and allies. Kaidu, a man who valued results over sentiment, recognized this early. He did not indulge her as a favored daughter, he deployed her as a tactical asset. By her late teens, she was riding beside him into battle, not as symbolic presence, but as combatant. Chinese sources, hostile and dismissive as they are, could not erase her from the record entirely. They describe her charging enemy lines during Kaidu's raids against Kublai's forces, riding into the chaos of cavalry combat with the kind of precision and fearlessness that only comes from years of training and repeated exposure to violence. They describe her reaching into the melee, grabbing enemy commanders by the arm or collar, and dragging them bodily from their saddles before wheeling her horse and returning to her father's side with her captives in tow. This was not myth. This was documented military action, recorded by scribes who had no interest in celebrating her and every reason to diminish her. The fact that they recorded it at all speaks to the impossibility of ignoring what she had become. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who passed through Kaidu's court sometime in the 1270s during his long journey across Asia, recorded his impressions of Khutulun with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He described her as beautiful and strong, a woman so skilled in combat that no man could match her, and he framed her wrestling matches as spectacle, exotic proof of the strangeness of Mongol customs. His account, filtered through the lens of a European merchant seeking to entertain his audience back home, stripped away the political context and reduced her to curiosity, but the underlying facts remained. She was famous. She was feared. She was her father's most trusted companion, riding with him on campaign, advising him on strategy, representing him in negotiations with tribal leaders and rival khans. She had become, in function if not in title, his chief strategist and most reliable enforcer. Her brothers, all 14 of them, commanded men and held positions of responsibility within Kaidu's confederation, but none of them occupied the position she did at their father's side. And this was not because Kaidu was sentimental or progressive in any modern sense. It was because she was better than they were, and he needed her. She was not an exception to the rule, not a fortunate anomaly that the system graciously allowed. She was a challenge to the rule, a living contradiction that forced everyone around her to confront the arbitrariness of the limitations placed on women. If a woman could ride, shoot, wrestle, command, and strategize as well as or better than men, then what justified excluding her from supreme authority? The steppe could not answer that question except through recourse to tradition, to the way things had always been, to the deeply embedded assumption that political legitimacy required maleness regardless of capability. Khutulun's existence exposed that assumption as exactly what it was, a social construct, not a natural law. And this made her dangerous, not merely to Kublai Khan, her father's enemy, but to the structure itself. Every victory she won, every commander she captured, every moment she spent at her father's side in council or on campaign was an implicit argument that the system was wrong. She did not need to articulate this argument. Her presence made it for her. And the system, as it always does when confronted with challenges it cannot theoretically refute, would respond not with logic, but with containment, not with acknowledgement, but with erasure. But that containment had not yet come. For now, in the high plateaus of Central Asia, in the war-torn borderlands between competing khanates, Khutulun rode beside her father as his greatest weapon, undefeated and undeniable. When Khutulun reached marriageable age, sometime in her late teens or early 20s, the suitors came. They arrived from across the fragmented empire, from the courts of rival khans and the camps of tribal confederations, from the edges of Kaidu's sphere of influence and beyond. They came with horses, gifts, and pedigree, representing families that sought alliance with Kaidu through the traditional mechanism of marriage, the exchange of daughters that had bound Mongol clans together since time beyond memory. Marriage was not romantic union in the steppe. It was political architecture, a way to seal alliances, end feuds, secure trade routes, and bind the loyalty of powerful families to a khan's cause. A daughter of Kaidu, especially one as famous and capable as Khutulun, was an asset of immense value, and every ambitious family with sons of marriageable age saw an opportunity. But Khutulun imposed a condition, borrowed from steppe tradition, yet weaponized to impossible extremes, a condition that transformed marriage from something done to her into a contest she controlled. Any man who wished to marry her must first defeat her in wrestling. If he won, she would marry him. If he lost, he would forfeit 100 horses. The condition was not symbolic. It was designed to be insurmountable. Wrestling held profound significance in Mongol culture, far beyond sport or entertainment. It was a test of physical prowess, balance, and technical skill, a way for men to prove themselves without lethal violence, and a central feature of the Nadam festival, the great summer gathering where tribes came together to compete in the three manly arts: archery, horsemanship, and wrestling. Champions were celebrated, their victories remembered in oral tradition, their status elevated within the social hierarchy. For Khutulun to challenge suitors to wrestling was not unprecedented. Mongol women occasionally wrestled, and the folklore of the steppe contained stories of warrior women who tested their suitors in physical contests. But those stories were myths, cautionary tales, or distant legends. Khutulun made the myth real. She took a narrative device from folklore and implemented it as material policy. And in doing so, she turned marriage, the primary mechanism by which women were controlled, transferred, and neutralized as political actors, into a proving ground she designed and dominated. The matches were public, conducted before Kaidu's court and visiting dignitaries, witnessed by hundreds and sometimes thousands of people. They were spectacle, political theater, and a form of defiance so audacious that it could not be ignored or dismissed. The first suitors came with confidence. They were experienced wrestlers, men who had won honors at tribal gatherings, who had trained since childhood in the techniques of balance, grip, and leverage that defined Mongol wrestling. They approached the match as a formality, assuming that Khutulun's reputation, however impressive, was exaggerated, that a woman could not truly match a man in raw physical contest. They were wrong. Khutulun defeated them methodically, efficiently, with the kind of technical precision that comes from thousands of hours of practice and an intuitive understanding of body mechanics. She did not rely on strength alone, though she was strong. She relied on timing, on reading her opponent's weight distribution and intentions, on exploiting mistakes before they fully formed. Wrestling at the elite level is not about overpowering an opponent. It is about making them defeat themselves, about creating situations where their own momentum works against them. Khutulun understood this at a level most of her challengers did not. She won her matches, and the horses were delivered. 100 horses per defeat. The suitors left humiliated, their families shamed, their prospects of alliance dissolved. But the suitors kept coming. Some came because they genuinely believed they could win, convinced that their training or size or experience would be enough. Others came because the political value of marrying Khutulun was worth the risk of losing 100 horses, a price they could afford if it meant binding Kaidu's power to their lineage. And some came because they could not afford not to, because refusing the challenge would signal weakness or disinterest, a political slight that could damage relationships with Kaidu's court. The matches became routine, a recurring spectacle that attracted audiences and generated stories that spread across the trade routes and caravan cities of Central Asia. Marco Polo, writing years later from memory and hearsay, claimed that Khutulun had defeated hundreds of challengers. Persian chroniclers recorded the matches as evidence of Mongol strangeness, a barbaric custom from a people who did not understand civilized norms. Chinese sources mentioned her wrestling in tones of disapproval and prurient fascination, framing it as further proof of the steppes' disorder and moral confusion. But none of them could deny the material outcome. Over the years, Khutulun amassed a herd of 10,000 horses, a fortune in steppe economics, wealth that translated directly into political and military power. Horses were currency, transportation, food, and the foundation of Mongol military dominance. A herd of 10,000 horses was the wealth of a Khan, and Khutulun had earned it through her own physical dominance and strategic brilliance. The wrestling condition was not, as her chroniclers suggested, about pride or romantic idealism. It was not the act of a woman too vain to accept a husband or too naive to understand the necessity of marriage. It was a calculated political maneuver, a way to retain autonomy in a system designed to strip her of it. Marriage, for a woman of Khutulun's status, meant the end of her military career, the end of her position at her father's side, the end of her independence. A husband would assume control of her wealth, her body, and her future. She would be absorbed into his family, expected to produce heirs, manage his household, and fade into the domestic role that the system reserved for women once their marriageability had been converted into alliance. She understood this with perfect clarity. The wrestling condition allowed her to delay that fate indefinitely, to maintain the fiction of eligibility while ensuring that no man could actually claim her. It was not refusal. It was refusal disguised as willingness, a rhetorical trap that used tradition against itself. She was not rejecting marriage. She was simply setting the terms, and those terms were impossible. But the condition also made her visible in ways that were increasingly dangerous. Every match she won, every suitor she defeated, every horse she added to her herd reinforced her reputation as a woman who exceeded the boundaries assigned to her. She was not content to advise quietly, to wield influence through whispers and intermediaries, to accept the limited power the system allowed women. She was flaunting her dominance, performing it publicly, turning herself into a symbol that challenged the foundational logic of patriarchal authority. And symbols, especially defiant ones, attract both admiration and hostility. Her victories made her legendary, but they also made her a problem. The Khans and generals who visited Kaidu's court watched her defeat their champions and saw not just a skilled wrestler, but a disruption. a woman who refused to be contained, who weaponized tradition instead of submitting to it. They began to whisper, they began to question Kaidu's judgment, and they began, slowly but inevitably, to turn marriage from a question of personal choice into a political necessity, not for Khutulun's sake, but for the stability of the system she was challenging. Word of Khutulun spread beyond the steppe, carried along the trade routes and caravan cities that connected the fragmented Mongol Empire to the wider world. Merchants traveling between Samarkand and Tabriz spoke of her in the bazaars. Diplomats returning from Kaidu's court reported her presence to their masters in distant capitals. Scribes and chroniclers trained in the literary traditions of Persia, China, and Europe encountered her story and attempted to render it legible within their own cultural frameworks, and in doing so, they distorted it. Persian historians, writing in the ornate prose style of the Ilkhanate courts, described Khutulun as a curiosity, an exotic outlier in the already strange and violent world of the Mongols. Rashid al-Din, the great Persian scholar and administrator who compiled the Jami al-Tawarikh, the most comprehensive history of the Mongol Empire written in the medieval period, mentioned her in passing, framing her wrestling matches as evidence of steppe customs that deviated from the civilized norms of sedentary societies. His tone was not hostile, but it was condescending, the tone of a man documenting the practices of a people he considered barbaric, despite their military dominance. To Rashid al-Din, Khutulun was interesting in the way that anthropological specimens are interesting, strange, worth recording, but ultimately peripheral to the serious business of dynastic politics and imperial administration. He reduced her agency to eccentricity, her military achievements to anecdote, and her political significance to footnote. Chinese chroniclers, writing from within the Yuan dynasty that Kublai Khan had established, treated Khutulun with even greater hostility. The official histories compiled by Confucian scholars had little conceptual space for women who commanded armies or defied patriarchal authority. Confucian ideology positioned women firmly within the domestic sphere, subordinate to fathers, husbands, and sons, valued for their capacity to produce heirs and maintain household harmony. A woman who wrestled men in public, who rode into battle, who rejected marriage and accumulated wealth in her own name, was not merely unusual, she was an aberration, a violation of the natural order. The Yuanshi, the official history of the Yuan dynasty, barely mentions her, and when it does, it is in the context of Kaidu's rebellion, framing her as evidence of his court's disorder and lack of legitimacy. The subtext is clear. A proper Khan would not allow his daughter to behave this way. The fact that Kaidu deployed her as a military asset, that he valued her counsel and relied on her capabilities, was presented not as pragmatism, but as weakness, as proof that he had lost control of his own household and therefore could not be trusted to govern an empire. The chroniclers did not engage with the substance of her achievements, they simply pathologized her existence. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who passed through Kaidu's court in the 1270s and later recorded his observations in the account known as the Travels, presented Khutulun to a European audience as exotic spectacle, a story designed to entertain and astonish readers who had never seen the steppe and never would. He described her as a woman of extraordinary beauty and strength, so skilled in combat that no man in her father's army could match her, and he recounted the wrestling condition in detail, emphasizing the 100-horse wager and the growing herd she had accumulated. Polo's account is valuable because it confirms details that might otherwise seem implausible. The wrestling matches were real, the condition was enforced, the horses were forfeit, but it is also deeply unreliable, filtered through the needs of a storyteller performing for an audience. Polo was not writing history in any rigorous sense. He was compiling a collection of marvels, wonders, and curiosities from the East, and Khutulun fit perfectly into that framework. She was the Mongol Amazon, the warrior princess, the woman who rejected love for pride, a figure legible to European audiences through the lens of classical mythology and chivalric romance. Polo stripped away the political context, the rebellion, the ideological conflict, the structural constraints that shaped her choices, and presented her as a freestanding curiosity, as if her refusal to marry were a personal quirk rather than a calculated strategy to retain autonomy in a system designed to eliminate it. Yet these accounts, filtered through patriarchal lenses and distorted by cultural assumptions, could not entirely erase the underlying truth. Khutulun was politically powerful, militarily indispensable, and culturally disruptive, and the chroniclers, however much they condescended or pathologized, could not deny those facts. They recorded her victories because the victories were too significant to ignore. They mentioned her presence at her father's side because her absence would have made the historical record incomplete. They described the wrestling matches because the matches had become part of the public identity of Kaidu's court, witnessed by too many people to be quietly erased. The accounts are hostile, dismissive, and fragmentary, but they are also confirmation. A woman who was merely eccentric or irrelevant would not have been recorded at all, especially not by chroniclers who had every ideological reason to minimize the achievements of women. The fact that Khutulun appears in multiple sources written in different languages by authors with different agendas is proof of her significance. She forced herself into the historical record despite the structural biases working against her. Her refusal to marry was not romantic rebellion, not the act of a woman too proud or naive to understand the necessity of alliance. It was refusal to be neutralized, a clear-eyed recognition that marriage, for a woman of her position, meant the end of everything she had built. Marriage would transfer her wealth to her husband's family, end her military career, remove her from her father's counsel, and reduce her to the domestic role that the system reserved for wives and mothers. She would be expected to produce heirs, manage a household, and fade into the background while her husband conducted the serious business of politics and war. She had watched this happen to other women. She had seen how marriage absorbed women's agency, how it converted their value into reproductive and domestic labor, how it rendered them invisible, except as extensions of their husbands and sons. She understood the mechanism with perfect clarity, and she refused it. The wrestling condition was not about finding a worthy husband. It was about making marriage functionally impossible while maintaining the appearance of eligibility, a strategy that allowed her to retain autonomy without openly defying the social expectation that women must marry. The outsiders who recorded her story understood none of this, or, if they understood it, they chose not to acknowledge it. To admit that Khutulun's refusal was rational and strategic would be to admit that the systems constraining women were arbitrary and unjust, and none of the chroniclers were prepared to make that admission. It was easier to frame her as curiosity, aberration, or romantic fool, to reduce her choices to personality rather than politics, to strip away the context that made her actions legible as resistance. But the resistance was there, encoded in every wrestling match, every horse she claimed, every year she remained unmarried and autonomous. The chroniclers could distort her story, but they could not erase it. And in their failure to erase it, in their compulsion to record what they could not fully comprehend, they preserved the evidence of a woman who understood the systems that sought to contain her and who fought, with every tool available, to remain free of them. She understood this better than her chroniclers, better than the suitors she defeated, better than the khans and generals who whispered about her in Kaidu's court. And that understanding, more than her physical strength or tactical brilliance, was what made her truly dangerous. Kaidu's war against Kublai Khan intensified through the 1280s and into the 1290s. A grinding, relentless conflict fought across the vast distances of Central Asia, from the Altai Mountains to the Tarim Basin, along trade routes and river valleys, in a landscape where logistics mattered as much as tactics, and where victory was measured not in decisive battles, but in the slow accumulation of territorial control and the exhaustion of enemy resources. Kublai, ruling from his capital at Khanbalik, with the full apparatus of Chinese imperial administration behind him, commanded vastly superior numbers, better supply lines, and the wealth of the most productive agricultural economy in the world. Kaidu commanded mobility, knowledge of terrain, and the loyalty of steppe warriors who had not forgotten the old ways. It was an asymmetric war, a contest between the sedentary power of empire and the insurgent resistance of traditionalism, and Khutulun fought at the front. She was not deployed as a symbolic presence, riding safely behind the lines to inspire morale or legitimize her father's cause. She was deployed as a combatant, a commander of cavalry units, someone who charged into the chaos of battle with the same expectations placed on any of Kaidu's generals. Chinese sources, written by officials, and chroniclers loyal to Kublai, recorded her presence on the battlefield with a mixture of outrage and reluctant admiration. They described her leading charges against Yuan dynasty forces, her horse moving with the trained precision of an animal that had been conditioned to the noise and violence of combat, her body low in the saddle, her movements economical and deliberate. They described her reaching into the melee, into the crush of horses and men and weapons, and dragging enemy commanders from their saddles with her bare hands, gripping them by the arm or collar, and hauling them bodily from their mounts before wheeling away and returning to her own lines with captives in tow. These were not metaphorical victories. These were documented military actions, recorded by hostile sources that had every reason to minimize or dismiss her role, but could not deny what their own soldiers had witnessed. She was not a symbol in those moments. She was a weapon, a tactical asset that Kaidu deployed with the same calculation he used for any other resource. Her presence disrupted enemy formations, demoralized opposing forces who had heard the stories and now faced the reality, and provided Kaidu with high-value prisoners who could be ransomed, interrogated, or exchanged. She returned from these engagements unscathed, or at least alive, which in the context of steppe cavalry warfare was its own form of extraordinary skill. Combat on horseback at close quarters was among the most dangerous forms of violence in the medieval world, a chaotic environment where a moment's distraction or miscalculation could result in death or maiming, where horses stumbled and riders were crushed, where arrows and blades found gaps in armor and flesh. That Khutulun survived these engagements repeatedly, that she continued to function as an effective combatant over years of sustained warfare, speaks to a level of skill and situational awareness that most warriors, male or female, never achieved. But her visibility came with escalating hostility, not merely from Kublai's forces, but from the broader political and cultural landscape of the Mongol world. Kublai's propagandists, operating out of the Yuan court and writing for an audience that included Chinese officials, Mongol aristocrats, and foreign diplomats, weaponized Khutulun's gender. They framed Kaidu's reliance on a daughter as weakness, as evidence that he lacked capable sons, that his court was disordered, that his rebellion was fundamentally illegitimate. They described his dependence on Khutulun as perversion, as a violation of natural hierarchy, as proof that he had abandoned not just the civilizing reforms of Kublai's reign, but the basic structures of patriarchal authority that governed all civilized societies. The rhetoric was deliberate and effective. It was not enough to defeat Kaidu militarily. Kublai needed to delegitimize him ideologically, to frame his rebellion as doomed not just strategically but morally, as the act of a man who had lost control of his own household and therefore could not be trusted to govern anything larger. Khutulun's prominence became a weapon in that propaganda war, her visibility transformed into evidence against her father. And the message resonated, not just in Kublai's court, but across the steppe itself. The nobility, the tribal leaders and clan heads who formed the backbone of Kaidu's coalition began to whisper. A woman commanding men destabilized the natural order. It created confusion, undermined hierarchy, and set a dangerous precedent. If Kaidu allowed his daughter to fight beside him, to advise him, to wield authority that should belong to men, what other traditions might he discard? What other boundaries might he violate? The whispers were not loud, not open rebellion, but they were corrosive, a slow accumulation of doubt and resentment that eroded the solidarity Kaidu needed to sustain his insurgency. Even within Kaidu's own camp, resentment simmered. Her 14 brothers, all of them capable warriors and commanders in their own right, watched her occupy the position at their father's side that by tradition and expectation should have belonged to the eldest son or the most accomplished general. They had fought in the same battles, endured the same hardships, demonstrated their loyalty and competence over years of sustained conflict. Yet, It was Khutulun whom Kaidu consulted first, Khutulun whose counsel carried the most weight, Khutulun whose reputation overshadowed theirs. The sources do not record open conflict between Khutulun and her brothers during this period, but the structural tension was inevitable. In a political system where inheritance and authority flowed through male lineage, where a Khan's sons expected to inherit his position and his wealth, Khutulun's prominence was a threat. She could not inherit, the system would not allow it, but her influence over their father meant that she could shape decisions about succession, could favor one brother over another, could wield power indirectly in ways that made her both invaluable and dangerous. Her brothers understood this. They understood that as long as she remained unmarried and autonomous, she occupied space that should have been theirs. And they understood, with increasing urgency, that her presence was becoming a liability, not just to themselves, but to the entire rebellion. The cost of Khutulun's defiance, then, was not borne by her alone. It radiated outward, affecting her father's legitimacy, straining his coalition, providing ammunition to his enemies, and creating fractures within his own family. Every victory she won on the battlefield was also a victory for Kublai's propagandists, who could point to her and say, "This is what Kaidu has become. A man so desperate or so corrupted that he relies on a woman." Every year she remained unmarried was another year of whispers and resentment, another year in which the nobility questioned Kaidu's judgment and his sons questioned their own futures. She was simultaneously indispensable and unsustainable, an asset her father could not afford to lose, and a problem he could not afford to ignore. The war with Kublai was not merely a military conflict. It was a contest over legitimacy, ideology, and the meaning of Mongol identity. And Khutulun, by her very existence, had become a central figure in that contest, a woman whose refusal to accept the limitations imposed on her had made her both a symbol of resistance and a source of vulnerability. The structure was closing in, not through direct assault, but through slow accumulation of pressure, through the whispers of nobles and the resentment of brothers and the propaganda of enemies, all of it converging toward a single inevitable conclusion: that Khutulun's autonomy, no matter how hard won or justified, could not be sustained indefinitely in a world determined to eliminate it. Under mounting pressure, political, familial, military, Kaidu finally demanded that Khutulun marry. The decision did not emerge suddenly, but rather accumulated across years of whispered dissent, strained alliances, and the relentless propaganda campaign waged by Kublai's court. The chronicles are fragmented here, their accounts contradictory and incomplete, shaped by the biases of chroniclers who had little interest in preserving the interior life of a woman they considered an aberration. What remains are pieces: a name, a date approximated to the late 1280s or early 1290s, scattered references in Persian and Chinese sources that confirm the marriage occurred but disagree on its circumstances and meaning. The outcome, however, is clear. Khutulun chose a husband, or was compelled to accept one, a minor general in her father's army named Abdakul, a man whose own historical footprint is so faint that he exists in the record almost exclusively through his connection to her. He was not a prince, not a Khan's son, not a suitor from a rival power seeking alliance through marriage. He was, by all evidence, a figure of limited political significance, someone who posed no threat to Kaidu's authority and made no claim to elevate his own family through the union. The match was strategic in its insignificance, carefully calibrated to satisfy the external pressure for Khutulun to marry without actually transferring power or wealth to a rival faction. The marriage was also face-saving, a symbolic gesture designed to quiet the whispers that had grown too loud to ignore. Kaidu's coalition depended on the loyalty of tribal leaders and steppe nobility, who had their own expectations about gender, propriety, and the proper ordering of authority. For years, Khutulun's unmarried status had been tolerable, explained away as the eccentricity of a Khan's favored daughter, a temporary condition that would eventually resolve itself. But as the war with Kublai dragged on and Kaidu's position became more precarious, that tolerance evaporated. The nobility needed reassurance that Kaidu had not abandoned tradition entirely, that his court was not descending into disorder, that the reliance on his daughter was an aberration that would be corrected. The marriage provided that reassurance, a visible demonstration that the structure was intact, that Khutulun had been brought into line, that the natural order had reasserted itself. It did not matter that the marriage changed nothing material about Khutulun's role. What mattered was the symbolism, the public acknowledgement that even she, the undefeated wrestler and battlefield commander, was subject to the same expectations as other women. But the marriage was also hollow, a performance of submission that preserved the form while gutting the substance. Khutulun did not relinquish her military role. She continued to ride with her father's forces, continued to advise him on strategy, continued to occupy the position she had held for years. Abtakul, her husband, did not replace her. He did not assume control of her wealth or her command. The sources do not describe him participating in major military decisions or appearing prominently in Kaidu's inner circle. He existed, married Khutulun, and then faded into the background of the historical record, a figure whose primary function was to provide legitimacy through his presence rather than authority through his actions. In this sense, the marriage was a compromise, a way for Khutulun to satisfy the external demand that she marry without actually surrendering the autonomy she had fought so hard to preserve. But compromises of this nature are inherently unstable. They satisfy no one fully. The nobility who had demanded the marriage saw it as confirmation of their authority, proof that even Khutulun could be contained when sufficient pressure was applied. Khutulun's brothers saw it as an opening, evidence that their father's favoritism could be challenged and overcome, that the position she occupied was not as secure as it had seemed. And Khutulun herself, whatever her private thoughts, unrecorded, unknowable, must have understood that the marriage, however strategic, represented a defeat. The wrestling matches stopped. There are no records of further challenges, no accounts of suitors arriving to test themselves against her after the marriage. The condition that had defined her public identity for years, the mechanism through which she had accumulated wealth and demonstrated her dominance, was rendered obsolete the moment she accepted a husband. The logic was inescapable. If she was married, she was no longer available, and if she was no longer available, there was no reason for the matches to continue. The herd of 10,000 horses, the fortune she had built through her own physical prowess, remained hers in some legal sense, but the accumulation stopped. The spectacle ended. The public theater of defiance that had made her famous and dangerous was quietly closed, not through open confrontation, but through the soft violence of social expectation. She had married, and marriage, even a hollow strategic marriage to a minor general, was enough to neutralize the challenge she represented. The system did not need to break her. It only needed to categorize her, to slot her into the role of wife and render her legible within the framework of patriarchal authority. The legend began to calcify into cautionary tale. The storytellers and chroniclers who had recorded her wrestling matches, her battlefield exploits, and her defiance now had an ending, and they shaped the narrative to fit their own ideological needs. In some versions, Khutulun was a tragic figure, a woman who had rejected love and companionship out of pride and was finally brought low by loneliness or political necessity. In others, she was a cautionary example, proof that women who defied their proper roles would ultimately be forced back into line, that the natural order could not be permanently disrupted. The Persian and Chinese chroniclers framed the marriage as resolution, as the restoration of normalcy after years of aberration. Marco Polo's account, written for a European audience hungry for exotic tales, transformed her into a romantic figure whose wrestling condition was about finding true love rather than retaining autonomy, a distortion that would shape Western perceptions of her story for centuries. The marriage allowed the chroniclers to domesticate her, to turn a story of political resistance into a story about a woman's inevitable submission to social expectation. Whether she chose the marriage willingly, recognizing that continued refusal would damage her, father's coalition, and her own position, or whether she yielded to inevitability, accepting what could no longer be avoided, the outcome was the same. The structure reasserted itself. The marriage to Abtakul marked a turning point, not in Khutulun's capabilities or even in her day-to-day activities, but in her symbolic status and the possibilities available to her. She had demonstrated, through years of wrestling matches and military service, that the limitations placed on women were arbitrary and could be challenged. But the system had demonstrated, through the slow accumulation of pressure and the final demand that she marry, that challenges without institutional support are ultimately unsustainable. She could be exceptional, but she could not be transformative. She could win every wrestling match, capture every enemy commander, and accumulate every horse. But she could not escape the fundamental fact that the political order required her subordination. The marriage was the mechanism through which that subordination was enforced, not through violence or coercion in any overt sense, but through the steady grinding pressure of a system that refused to accommodate her existence outside its prescribed categories. She had fought that system with every tool available to her, and for years she had succeeded in carving out space that should not have existed. But space carved out is not space secured, and the marriage was proof that the system had always been waiting, patient and relentless, for the moment when it could close that space and restore the order she had disrupted. When Kaidu died in 1301, after more than 40 years of sustained rebellion against the Yuan dynasty and a lifetime spent trying to preserve what he believed was the authentic Mongol way of life, Khutulun stood at the center of a succession crisis that exposed every contradiction the steppe nobility had spent decades pretending did not exist. Kaidu had not died in battle, as might have been expected for a man who had spent most of his life at war, but from illness or exhaustion, his body finally succumbing to age and the accumulated strain of decades spent commanding armies and managing fractious alliances across the unforgiving terrain of Central Asia. The sources do not record his final words or intentions with any clarity, but the political reality was unmistakable. Khutulun was his chosen heir, the child he had relied on most consistently, the one whose counsel he had valued above all others, the one who had fought beside him, strategized with him, and represented his authority in ways that none of her 14 brothers had matched. She was more capable than they were by every measure that should have mattered in a meritocratic system rooted in martial prowess and demonstrated competence. She was more loyal, having never wavered in her commitment to her father's cause, even when that commitment cost her autonomy and subjected her to years of hostile scrutiny. She was more experienced, having participated in military campaigns and political negotiations at the highest levels for nearly 2 decades. By the logic that the Mongols claimed to value, the logic of strength, skill, and proven ability, she was the obvious successor. But the Khans and generals refused. They refused immediately, without deliberation or debate, as if the question itself were absurd. A woman could not rule. The objection was not framed as a judgment of Khutulun's individual capabilities, though some surely questioned whether her military successes had been exaggerated or whether her influence over Kaidu had been appropriate. The objection was structural, rooted in the foundational logic of patriarchal authority that governed not just Mongol society, but nearly every political system in the medieval world. A Khan was not merely an administrator or strategist, he was a war leader, someone who commanded men in battle, who embodied the legitimacy of the lineage, who performed authority in ways that required maleness as a precondition. Khutulun could fight, advise, and manage, but she could not be Khan, because being Khan required a form of political legitimacy that the system reserved exclusively for men. The same nobility that had celebrated her victories, that had watched her drag enemy commanders from their saddles and accumulate a fortune in horses, now used her gender as absolute disqualification. It did not matter what she had done, it mattered what she was. Her brothers, lesser men by all accounts, tore the Khanate apart in civil war. The sources are fragmented and contradictory, offering competing claims about which brother had the strongest support, which alliances were formed and broken, and which acts of violence marked the disintegration of Kaidu's coalition. What is clear is that none of the brothers possessed the singular authority or capability to unite the Khanate peacefully. They were competent commanders and administrators, men who had been raised in the same harsh environment as Khutulun and who had served their father loyally. But they lacked her strategic vision, her political instincts, and the years of accumulated trust that came from being Kaidu's closest confidant. In a rational system, this would have been obvious. In the system that actually existed, it was irrelevant. The brothers fought each other for supremacy, forming temporary alliances with rival khans, making promises they could not keep, and expending the military and political capital that Kaidu had built over 4 decades of careful rebellion. The Khanate fractured, its territories divided among competing claimants, its unity shattered by the same internal divisions that Kaidu had spent his life trying to prevent. The irony was brutal and inescapable. The man who had waged a 40-year war to preserve Mongol tradition saw his life's work destroyed by the very traditions he had championed, by a system that valued male lineage over demonstrated competence. Khutulun fought to preserve her father's vision, not by claiming the title of Khan. She understood that was impossible, but by attempting to broker peace among her brothers, to hold together the coalition through negotiation and the residual authority she still commanded. She had wealth, military experience, and a reputation that extended across the Mongol world. She had relationships with tribal leaders, knowledge of the political landscape, and the strategic understanding necessary to navigate the complex web of alliances and enmities that defined Central Asian politics. In another system, or even in the same system under different circumstances, this might have been enough. She might have ruled as regent or as the power behind a nominal Khan, managing the Khanate while one of her brothers served as figurehead, but she was outmaneuvered, not militarily but politically, by men who understood that the real threat she posed was not to their individual ambitions, but to the structure itself. If Khutulun were allowed to wield authority after Kaidu's death, even indirectly, it would set a precedent that could not be contained. It would demonstrate that women could exercise political power at the highest levels, that the exclusion of women from supreme authority was a choice rather than a natural law. And so the nobility closed ranks. The same khans and generals who had once praised her victories, who had witnessed her competence firsthand and benefited from her father's reliance on her counsel, now turned her gender into an insurmountable obstacle. They did not need to defeat her in combat or prove her incompetent. They simply needed to refuse her legitimacy, to insist that the question of succession could only be resolved among Kaidu's sons, to frame her attempts at mediation as interference rather than leadership. The whispers that had begun years earlier, the resentment that had simmered beneath the surface during her father's lifetime, now erupted into open hostility. She was accused of overstepping, of manipulating her father, of seeking power that was not rightfully hers. The accusations were not new, but they no longer needed to be whispered. With Kaidu dead, there was no one left to protect her, no authority powerful enough to override the collective judgment of the nobility. Her brothers, competing viciously with each other, found common ground only in their shared interest in excluding her from the succession. They could not agree on who should rule, but they could agree on who should not. Khutulun had broken every rule except the one that mattered most. She had refused marriage for years, accumulating wealth and autonomy through her wrestling matches. She had fought in battles, captured enemy commanders, and commanded the respect of hardened warriors. She had advised her father on matters of war and diplomacy, functioning as his chief strategist and most trusted confidant. She had demonstrated, repeatedly and undeniably, that the limitations placed on women were arbitrary and that she possessed every quality the system claimed to value. But the system did not value those qualities above its own preservation. It valued hierarchy, male authority, and the maintenance of boundaries that kept women subordinate, regardless of their individual capabilities. Khutulun had pushed against those boundaries for decades, carving out space that should not have existed, but the space was never secure. It existed only because her father allowed it, and when he died, the system reasserted itself with the cold efficiency of a structure that had survived for centuries precisely because it did not tolerate exceptions. She had proven that a woman could do everything a Khan did, but she could not prove that a woman could be a Khan, because the system had already decided that question before she was born. Khutulun disappears from the historical record shortly after Kaidu's death in 1301, her presence in the chronicles simply ceasing as if she had been carefully excised from a manuscript, leaving only the faint impression of what had been written before. No chronicler records her end, there is no account of her death, No description of illness or battle wound, no funeral or memorial, no distribution of her wealth among heirs, none of the documentary traces that typically mark the passing of a figure of political significance in the medieval world. The sources that had mentioned her repeatedly during her father's lifetime, Persian histories, Chinese dynastic records, the scattered accounts of merchants and travelers, simply stop acknowledging her existence. It is not that the chroniclers ran out of things to say about the succession crisis or the fragmentation of Kaidu's Khanate. They continued to write about the wars among her brothers, the shifting alliances, the eventual absorption of Kaidu's territories into other Khanates. They simply wrote as if Khutulun had never been part of that story, as if the woman who had commanded cavalry and advised her father and amassed 10,000 horses had vanished not just from life, but from memory itself. Persian sources, when they mention her at all in the years following Kaidu's death, offer only the vaguest suggestions. Rashid al-Din, writing in the early 14th century with access to Mongol informants and official records, hints that she died young, though he provides no date, no cause, and no detail that would allow later historians to verify the claim or understand the circumstances. The phrasing is brief, almost dismissive, the kind of sentence that suggests the author considered the matter closed and unworthy of further investigation. Other Persian chroniclers ignore her post-1301 entirely, focusing their attention on the male leaders who divided Kaidu's legacy and the broader political developments in the Ilkhanate and Central Asia. Chinese accounts are even more thorough in their erasure. The Yuanxi, the official history of the Yuan dynasty compiled in the mid-14th century, makes no mention of Khutulun after Kaidu's death and barely mentions her during his lifetime. To the Confucian scholars who compiled that history, she was an embarrassment, an aberration that reflected poorly on the dynasty's enemies and had no place in a serious historical record. They documented the succession crisis among Kaidu's sons, the eventual pacification of his territories, and Kublai Khan's consolidation of control over the fractious empire. But they did so as if Khutulun had played no role in any of it, as if her decades of military service and political influence had been irrelevant to the outcome. Mongol oral tradition, collected and transcribed centuries later by ethnographers and historians working in the 19th and 20th centuries, offers a different kind of erasure, not silence, but transformation. In these oral accounts passed down through generations of storytellers and shaped by the narrative needs of each retelling, Khutulun becomes myth. She is no longer a historical figure navigating the complex political realities of a fragmenting empire, but a character in a moral fable, a cautionary tale, or an inspirational legend depending on the teller's intent. In some versions, she is the tragic heroine who rejected love for pride, a beautiful and capable woman who set her standards too high and died alone, her refusal to marry framed not as political strategy, but as romantic folly. In other versions, she is a warrior goddess, a figure of superhuman strength and courage who could not be defeated by any man and who ascended into legend, her story ending not with death, but with disappearance into the realm of myth where heroes go when the mortal world can no longer contain them. These oral traditions preserve her name and some of the basic facts of her life, the wrestling matches, the horses, the battlefield exploits, but they strip away the political context, the structural constraints, the calculated resistance that made her story historically significant. They transform her into folklore, and in doing so, they render her safe, a figure who can be celebrated or mourned without threatening the systems that sought to contain her. The silence is deliberate. It is not the silence of lost records or accidental neglect, but the silence of archival violence, the systematic erasure of figures whose existence challenges the narratives that empires tell about themselves. Women who defy empires, who claim authority that the system reserves for men, who demonstrate through their actions that the boundaries of gender are political constructs rather than natural laws, cannot be remembered accurately without destabilizing the ideological foundations of patriarchal power. The chroniclers who recorded Khutulun's wrestling matches and battlefield victories during her father's lifetime did so because they could not avoid it. She was too visible, too successful, too integral to Kaidu's rebellion to be ignored entirely. But once Kaidu was dead, and the succession had been resolved in favor of her brothers, there was no longer any need to acknowledge her. She had served her narrative function as proof of Kaidu's eccentricity or as evidence of the steppe's barbarism, and now she could be quietly removed from the story. The Persian chroniclers moved on to other subjects. The Chinese scholars excluded her from their official histories. And the Mongol oral tradition, lacking the written records that might have preserved her complexity, reshaped her into the kind of character that folklore requires: simplified, moralized, detached from historical causality. Khutulun was too dangerous to remember accurately, because accurate memory would require acknowledging what she had proven. She had proven that women could command armies as effectively as men, that they could excel in the martial skills the steppe valued above all others, that they could wield political influence and accumulate wealth through their own capabilities rather than through marriage or male patronage. She had proven, in other words, that the exclusion of women from supreme authority was arbitrary, a choice made by the system to preserve its own structure rather than a reflection of natural or divine order. To remember her accurately would be to preserve that proof, to hand down to future generations a documented example of a woman who had done everything the system claimed women could not do. And so the system chose not to remember her accurately. It chose silence or transformation into myth or reduction to cautionary tale. It chose to erase the parts of her story that were most threatening and to preserve only the parts that could be safely contained within existing narratives about women's proper roles and the consequences of defying them. The Yuanxi, the official chronicle of the Yuan dynasty compiled between 1368 and 1370 by scholars working under the newly established Ming dynasty, erases her almost entirely. The Yuanxi is a massive work spanning more than 200 volumes, documenting in exhaustive detail the administration, military campaigns, succession disputes, and cultural developments of the Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty from its founding under Kublai Khan through its collapse in the mid-14th century. It records the names of generals, administrators, tribute missions, rebellions, natural disasters, astronomical phenomena, and countless other details deemed worthy of preservation by the Confucian scholars who compiled it. Yet Khutulun, a woman who commanded cavalry units, advised one of the most significant rebel leaders of the late 13th century, and became famous enough that merchants and travelers recorded her exploits across 3 continents, receives barely a mention. When she appears at all, it is in passing, in the context of her father's rebellion, with no acknowledgement of her military role, her wrestling matches, or her position within Kaidu's inner circle. The omission is not oversight. It is editorial decision, a choice made by compilers who understood that including Khutulun in any substantive way would complicate the narrative they were constructing about proper governance, legitimate authority, and the natural order of gender relations. The Jami al-Tawarikh, Persia's grand history compiled by Rashid al-Din in the early 14th century under the patronage of the Ilkhanate, reduces her to footnote. Rashid al-Din had access to Mongol oral tradition, official records, and informants from across the empire. His history is remarkable for its scope and detail, attempting to document not just the Mongol conquests, but the genealogies, customs, and internal politics of the various khanates. He recorded the names and deeds of Mongol princesses who served as regents, managed vast estates, and influenced succession disputes. He acknowledged, in other words, that women could wield power within the Mongol system. But Khutulun, whose power was more visible and more transgressive than that of most Mongol women, receives minimal attention. Rashid al-Din mentions her wrestling matches briefly, frames them as curious custom rather than political strategy, and offers no detail about her military service or her role in the succession crisis. The treatment is dismissive, the tone suggesting that she is worth mentioning only as an exotic detail, a colorful anecdote that adds texture to the broader narrative but does not merit serious historical analysis. The footnote status is itself revealing. It confirms that Rashid al-Din knew about her, that her story was circulating widely enough that he could not ignore it entirely, but that he chose to minimize her significance, to place her at the margins of his narrative rather than acknowledging her centrality to Kaidu's rebellion and its aftermath. The steppe genealogies, the oral and written records that documented Mongol lineages and served as the foundation for political legitimacy within the nomadic confederations, omit her descendants entirely. This omission is particularly striking because Mongol genealogies were obsessive in their documentation of bloodlines, tracing descent from Genghis Khan through multiple generations, recording marriages, children, and the distribution of territories among heirs. The genealogies were not merely historical records, they were political documents used to justify claims to authority, settle disputes over inheritance, and establish hierarchies within the fractured empire. A woman of Khutulun's prominence, married to a general and possessing immense wealth, should have left a genealogical trace. Her children, if she had any, should appear in the records connected to her father's lineage and potentially claiming portions of his legacy. But they do not. Either she had no children, which is possible but unrecorded, or her children were excluded from the genealogies, written out of the lineage as if they had never existed. The latter possibility suggests a deliberate effort to sever her connection to Kaidu's legacy, to ensure that no future claimant could invoke her name or her bloodline to justify political authority. This is not loss of records in any passive sense. This is archival violence, the active suppression of information that threatens the ideological coherence of imperial narratives. Women who commanded armies, who rejected marriage or accepted it only on their own terms, who claimed inheritance and wielded authority that the system reserved for men, destabilized the stories that empires told about themselves. Those stories required clear hierarchies, unambiguous gender roles, and the appearance of natural order. They required that authority flow through male lineages, that women exercise power only indirectly through sons and husbands, and that exceptions to these rules be minimized or explained away as temporary aberrations. Khutulun could not be minimized. Her achievements were too visible, too well documented by too many sources. She could not be explained away as a regent acting on behalf of an underage son, or as a widow temporarily managing her husband's estate, or as any of the other categories that allowed the system to accommodate women's power without acknowledging it as legitimate in its own right. She was a woman who had wielded authority directly, who had commanded men in battle, who had accumulated wealth through her own prowess, and who had nearly inherited a khanate. To remember her accurately, to include her in the official histories with the same level of detail afforded to male commanders and generals, would be to create a record that future generations could point to as evidence that the exclusion of women from supreme authority was arbitrary rather than natural. Khutulun's erasure was ideological maintenance, the routine work that patriarchal systems performed to preserve their own legitimacy. The chroniclers who compiled the Yuanshi were not engaged in a conspiracy to suppress Khutulun specifically. They were following the established protocols of Confucian historiography, which prioritized male rulers and administrators and treated women as significant only insofar as they affected male political actors. Rashid al-Din was not attempting to erase Khutulun from history when he reduced her to footnote. He was making editorial decisions about what mattered, and within his framework, a woman's wrestling matches and battlefield exploits mattered less than the succession disputes and military campaigns conducted by men. The genealogists who omitted her descendants were not destroying records out of malice. They were maintaining the integrity of lineages that served as the foundation for political claims, and a woman whose authority had been contested and whose legacy had been rejected by the nobility could not be allowed to contaminate those lineages. Each act of omission, reduction, or minimization was individually rational within the logic of the system that produced it. Collectively, they constituted archival violence, the systematic removal of evidence that the system's rules were arbitrary and could be challenged. To remember Khutulun accurately would be to admit the arbitrariness of the systems that excluded her. It would be to acknowledge that a woman could possess every quality that the Mongol system claimed to value: martial prowess, strategic intelligence, loyalty, courage, and still be denied authority solely because of her gender. It would be to preserve for future generations a documented case study in how patriarchal structures operate, how they accommodate exceptional women up to a point and then contain them, how they erase or distort the historical record to prevent those exceptions from becoming precedents. The chroniclers understood this, consciously or unconsciously, and they made their choices accordingly. They chose to protect the system rather than document the truth. They chose ideological coherence over historical accuracy. And in doing so, they revealed exactly what the silence around Khutulun was designed to conceal. That her exclusion from power was not inevitable, not natural, not the result of any deficiency on her part, but rather the deliberate choice of a system that could not afford to acknowledge what her existence proved. Khutulun's life reveals the limits of exceptionalism within patriarchal systems, the precise boundaries beyond which individual capability, no matter how extraordinary, cannot push without triggering the structure's self-protective mechanisms. She was allowed to fight, to ride beside her father into battle, to capture enemy commanders and accumulate a reputation that spread across continents. She was allowed to win, repeatedly and publicly, defeating every suitor who challenged her in wrestling and amassing a fortune of 10,000 horses that represented wealth on the scale of a Khan. She was allowed to accumulate power, to advise her father on strategy and diplomacy, to function as his chief confidant and most reliable enforcer, to wield authority that in substance, if not in title, resembled that of a supreme commander. But she was allowed these things only as long as she remained daughterly, operating within the framework of filial loyalty and paternal authority, her power always mediated through her father rather than claimed in her own right. She was allowed them only as long as she remained unmarried, a status that marked her as exceptional and temporary, a woman whose autonomy existed in the liminal space between daughter and wife, a space that tradition acknowledged but did not valorize. And she was allowed them only as long as she remained non-threatening to male succession,